You know, it's a strange thing, how history actually turns. It doesn't always shift in broad daylight, in front of cameras, with parades and speeches. More often than not, the axis of the world changes quietly, in the middle of the night, through a single decision, a phone call, a moment of conviction that sets in motion consequences too vast to be measured immediately. And what's remarkable about this, what's deeply symbolic, is that it reminds us of the individual's role in shaping the destiny of nations. Now think about that for a moment. We tend to imagine that world orders are built only by empires, by collective forces, by faceless systems. But in truth, sometimes it is the courage, or the calculation, of one leader at one precise moment that can redefine alliances, alter power structures, and send ripples across decades. And that is exactly what we saw with Narendra Modi's late night call. What unfolded wasn't just diplomacy. It was a declaration, a shift, a signal that the global hierarchy was no longer set in stone. That India was not simply reacting to the world order, but was stepping into the arena as a force capable of reshaping it. When you examine the course of human history, what you notice is that it isn't necessarily the vast armies, the massive economies, or even the sweeping ideologies that immediately alter the trajectory of nations. Those things matter, of course, but they often come into play after something much smaller, much more human, has already occurred. What changes history, truly, profoundly, are the decisions made in moments of immense responsibility by individuals who carry the weight of entire civilizations on their shoulders, and it's usually not in public. It's often in silence, in solitude, sometimes in the middle of the night when the world is asleep. Now, why is that important? Because it shatters the illusion that individuals don't matter. We are conditioned, especially in the modern world, to think in terms of systems, global finance, political blocs, corporate giants, international organizations. But systems are only animated by human beings, by their courage or their cowardice, in the critical moment. A single decision can echo for decades, sometimes centuries. Think of Churchill's refusal to surrender to Hitler, or Gorbachev's hesitation that allowed the Soviet Union to unravel. These were not collective acts. They were singular points of decision that cascaded into history. So when Prime Minister Modi made that late night call, it was not just a matter of routine diplomacy. It was the assertion of something far larger, the reality that one individual, one leader in one nation could alter the gravitational pull of international relations. In that moment, India was not just another player. It became a shaper of the game. That is a profound transformation, because until recently, India was often seen as peripheral to the great power struggle. That call challenged that perception, not in theory, but in practice. And here's the deeper truth. Decisions made under the pressure of responsibility reveal the true character of leadership. They test whether a leader acts out of fear, complacency, or conviction. A late night call implies urgency. It means the stakes were high enough that waiting until morning was not an option. It means the calculus of risk and opportunity tipped so dramatically that action had to be immediate. That urgency carries within it the seed of transformation. What we should learn from this is that the world doesn't simply move on its own. It isn't an impersonal machine grinding away through history. It is directed, redirected, sometimes completely overturned by human choice. And the paradox is this: we only recognize those decisions as turning points after the consequences have already unfolded. At the time, they often appear small, almost invisible. Yet later, we realize they were seismic. That's what makes this so compelling. Modi's late night call will be remembered not just for its immediate outcomes, but for what it symbolized, the undeniable fact that leadership, exercised decisively, can tilt the scales of power. And if that is true for nations, it is equally true for individuals. The choices you make in your own quiet hours may well change the course of your life, and perhaps far more than you can possibly imagine. One of the most fascinating developments in the 21st century is the rise of India as not merely a regional power, but as a genuine global balancing force. And that term, balancing force, is worth some serious reflection, because the balance of power has always been central to the stability or instability of the world order. When a single nation dominates without opposition, it tends toward arrogance, expansion, and eventual collapse. When too many nations compete without balance, chaos emerges and conflict becomes inevitable. What stabilizes the system is the presence of a force that can act as both a counterweight and a bridge. India is becoming exactly that. For decades, the narrative of global power was binary: the United States and its allies on one side, and the Soviet Union, and later China, on the other. Smaller nations often had to choose, aligning themselves completely with one camp or the other. But India has been carving a different path. Rather than being swallowed by either pole, it has developed the capacity to engage with both while retaining its independence. That is not weakness, that is strength of a rare kind, the kind that makes a nation indispensable to the functioning of the world order. Now, how has India achieved this? It's not only through economic growth, though that is critical. India's economy is expanding at a pace that rivals, and in some cases surpasses, the traditional Western powers. Nor is it only through military development, although India's strategic position and growing defense capability cannot be ignored. At its root, India's emergence is philosophical. It represents a civilizational confidence, a refusal to submit to being defined by someone else's terms. And in a world where identity, sovereignty, and cultural continuity are under pressure, that confidence becomes magnetic. Nations that feel crushed between larger powers are looking to India as an example, a partner, a balancing presence. This is precisely why Modi's late night call carries symbolic weight. It wasn't just a matter of communication, it was a declaration of role. India was saying, we are not simply here to follow. We are here to mediate, to negotiate, to balance, and when necessary, to lead. That matters because the United States, for all its dominance, can no longer unilaterally dictate the terms of global engagement. And China, for all its ambition, cannot simply bulldoze its way into global leadership without resistance. India's position in the middle, yet rising higher every year, provides the world with an alternative axis of stability. This balance doesn't come without risk. Walking between giants is a precarious act, and it demands extraordinary leadership. But the very fact that India can occupy this role suggests a maturity in statecraft that few nations have mastered. It represents the beginning of a multipolar order, one in which no single nation commands unchecked authority, and in which India's presence ensures that the global equilibrium does not collapse into dominance or chaos. And so the late night call becomes more than just a moment. It becomes a symbol of India's destiny, to be the hand that steadies the scales of power in a turbulent world. For centuries, the world order has been written and dictated primarily through a Western lens. The frameworks of economics, politics, education, even morality on the global stage, these have been overwhelmingly shaped by Europe first, and then by the United States. The assumption, often unstated but deeply ingrained, was that Western civilization was not just dominant in material power, but also in wisdom, direction, and authority. And to a large extent, the rest of the world accepted this framing, either out of necessity or out of a sense of inferiority, or because there seemed to be no alternative. But what happens when a civilization that is thousands of years old, older than the very foundations of the West, refuses to play by those inherited rules? What happens when it insists on defining success, development, and leadership on its own terms? That is the challenge India now presents, and it is a challenge the West can no longer ignore. Modi's late night call was not only strategic in nature, it was symbolic. It was a moment where India effectively said, we are not simply participants in the Western designed system. We are not here to merely adapt to the structures you created. We are here to question them, to reshape them, to propose alternatives. This is no small matter. It signals the rise of a civilization that has absorbed centuries of colonization, condescension, and exclusion, yet has emerged not broken, but stronger, more confident, and willing to assert its own values on the global stage. The deeper truth here is that the Western-Centric order, for all its achievements, is showing cracks. Its promises of universal prosperity and stability are faltering. Its moral authority is questioned, not just by rivals, but even by its own citizens, who feel alienated by systems that no longer reflect their identity or serve their interests. In such a moment of weakness, the rise of India doesn't just introduce another player into the game, it redefines the game itself, and this is not a matter of aggression or hostility. It's not about India trying to dominate in the way Western powers once did. Instead, it's about India asserting that the global order must be plural, reflective of multiple traditions, values, and ways of life. This is a profound psychological shift. The Western narrative of being the universal standard is now being contested by a nation that has both the population and the power to demand recognition. For the rest of the world, especially nations that feel marginalized by the West, this shift is liberating. It suggests that there is room for more than one voice, more than one definition of progress, more than one model of governance, and that's why Modi's call resonates far beyond its immediate diplomatic context. It symbolizes a tectonic change, the decline of unquestioned Western centrality and the rise of a world where India's vision, rooted in its ancient civilization and modern ambitions, cannot be sidelined. What we are witnessing is not just a geopolitical adjustment, but a rewriting of the narrative of global power. And once a story changes, everything else follows. Strategic alliances have always been the invisible architecture of world order. They shape wars and peace, trade and prosperity, security and collapse. Nations do not exist in isolation. They exist in webs of promises, treaties, rivalries, and partnerships. But the problem with alliances is that they are never permanent. They are living organisms, shifting as the interests of their members change. And here lies the significance of India's late night call. It did not merely signal communication, it redefined the very patterns of alignment that the world has long taken for granted. For decades, the global map was divided by predictable lines. NATO symbolized Western unity, the Soviet bloc symbolized communist solidarity, and later, China sought to draw nations into its orbit through infrastructure, trade, and power projection. The alliances of the 20th century were largely rigid, with nations often locked into one side or the other. But in the 21st century, rigidity is death. Nations that cannot adapt become pawns rather than players. What Modi's action demonstrated was India's capacity to reshape alliances, not by submission to one camp, but by cultivating relationships across multiple axes of power. This is something radically new. India can sit at the table with the United States, deepen cooperation in technology and defense, and at the same time maintain robust ties with Russia, a nation that the West often seeks to isolate. It can participate in forums with China, even while opposing Chinese aggression on its borders. It can engage the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa with a credibility that the Western powers sometimes lack because of their colonial past. That flexibility does not signal weakness. It signals mastery. It shows that India is not bound by inherited categories, but is writing its own rules of engagement. What makes this even more remarkable is that alliances today are not merely military or territorial. They are technological, cultural, and even ideological. The nation that can command trust across these diverse arenas wields an influence disproportionate to its raw power. And India, through its late-night diplomacy, is showing that it can be trusted by many, perhaps more than any other global actor. This is a form of strategic capital that cannot be purchased. It must be earned. The deeper lesson here is that alliances are not just about protecting oneself. They are about shaping the environment in which decisions are made. By redefining alliances, India is not merely ensuring its survival. It is altering the possibilities available to every other nation. It is signaling that the future will not be dictated by a single superpower, nor by the coercion of an authoritarian bloc, but through a complex balance in which India has positioned itself at the center. And so the late-night call stands as a metaphor for this larger truth. The age of fixed alliances is ending, and the age of dynamic, multipolar partnerships is beginning. In that transition, India has seized the initiative. It is no longer the nation that adapts to others' choices. It is the nation that forces others to adapt to its own. There is something profoundly underestimated in the study of geopolitics, and that is the role of national identity. We often talk about economics, about military power, about resources and geography, as though they alone determine the fate of nations. But the truth is more subtle, more psychological, and in some sense more dangerous. It is the identity of a people, their shared sense of who they are, what they stand for, and what destiny they believe is theirs, that ultimately determines their influence in the world. And India today is perhaps the clearest example of how a nation's identity can become a source of global power. For decades after independence, India was searching for itself. It bore the scars of colonization, the trauma of partition, and the burden of poverty. Its identity was fractured, suspended between modernity and tradition, between imported systems and indigenous wisdom. This uncertainty kept India cautious, hesitant, unwilling to fully assert itself on the world stage. But in recent years, something has shifted. The call that Modi made in the quiet hours of the night was not simply an act of statecraft. It was the voice of a nation that has rediscovered its confidence. This confidence is not arrogance. It is not a claim to superiority. It is the conviction that India has something unique to contribute to the world, something rooted in thousands of years of civilizational continuity. It is a nation that has survived invasion, colonization, and division, yet still holds to its cultural soul. That kind of resilience creates an identity that cannot be easily dismissed. And when such an identity is finally mobilized by leadership, it becomes a form of power that no economic sanction or military threat can extinguish. This is what makes India's rise so significant. Its power is not merely external, it is internal, grounded in the self-perception of its people. When a nation believes in itself, when it rallies behind a vision of unity and purpose, it becomes capable of shaping events far beyond its borders. And this is precisely what the late night call symbolized, that India is no longer content to be defined by others, but will define itself, and in doing so, shape the world. National identity as global influence is a phenomenon we have seen before. The United States drew power not only from its wealth, but from its belief in freedom and democracy, however inconsistently applied. The Soviet Union projected influence not merely through its armies, but through its ideological vision of communism. China today wields power not only through factories and technology, but through its narrative of rejuvenation after humiliation. And now India stands among them, its identity shaped by dharma, diversity, democracy, and resilience. What Modi's action revealed is that when identity is aligned with leadership, a nation becomes more than just a participant. It becomes a force that alters the psychological balance of the entire global system. And the world cannot ignore it because identity is contagious. It inspires, it intimidates, and it redefines what is possible. The late night call, then, was not just India speaking to another nation. It was India declaring to the world, we know who we are now, and because we know, the world will have to listen. Symbols matter. In fact, they often matter more than the literal events themselves. Human beings are creatures of story and meaning, and we interpret our actions and the actions of our leaders not only in terms of practical consequences, but in terms of the symbols they represent. That is why the late night call by Prime Minister Modi has already outgrown the narrow confines of a diplomatic gesture. It has become a symbol, a representation of India's arrival as a nation not merely participating in the world order but shaping it. Think about it. A phone call on the surface is an ordinary thing. Leaders make them all the time, but context is everything. This was not just a matter of communication. It was a moment of declaration. A late night call suggests urgency, it suggests decisiveness, it suggests that the world cannot wait until tomorrow morning, and when such an act comes from the leader of a nation once considered peripheral to global power, it forces the world to reevaluate its assumptions. Suddenly, India is not knocking at the door of history, it is stepping through it. This act functions as a symbol of leadership in two ways. First, it demonstrates that India is willing to take initiative. It is no longer simply responding to the movements of others, but is asserting its own timing, its own rhythm, its own sense of what matters. Second, it communicates to India's own people that their nation is strong, respected, and capable of influencing events at the highest level. That psychological reinforcement is critical because the legitimacy of a rising power comes as much from internal confidence as from external recognition, but there is a deeper level. When an action becomes symbolic, it sets a precedent. It establishes an expectation that similar acts will follow. The late night call, then, is not only a one-time event, it is the beginning of a pattern. It tells the world, India will not be silent when decisions are made. India will intervene, will participate, and will lead when it chooses. That message reverberates in capitals across the globe, and once it has been sent, it cannot be ignored. This is why symbols are powerful. They change perception, and perception changes behavior. If nations begin to see India as a leader, they will treat it as a leader. If India sees itself as a leader, it will act like one. The late night call in this way functions like a seed. It is small, perhaps barely visible, but it carries within it the potential to grow into something vast, something capable of altering the landscape entirely. And that is how world orders shift, not always through war, not always through revolutions, but through symbolic acts that redefine the boundaries of what is possible. Modi's call was not just about the words spoken that night. It was about signaling the dawn of India's future leadership in a multipolar world. So, when we look back on this event years from now, we may not remember the details of the conversation, but we will remember the symbol. The moment India's voice was no longer just one among many, but the voice that changed the rhythm of the world itself.